Next, the player returns to the combine fence at the start of the level and proceeds through the hallway. There is a small ambush waiting for the player around the corner, but these are slow-moving zombies and the player has more than enough time to back up to a safe distance and aim for their weak points. As a side note, I try to leave the player just enough ammo and resources to make it from beginning to end. The player doesn't need to kill anything aside from a mini-boss to complete the level, but it certainly makes their life easier. The gameplay of Half-Life Alyx encourages the player to adopt a scavenging playstyle. In order for the player to never have too much or too little, Valve handles resources by placing items in a container based on how well the player is doing on resources. In my level, I did not take advantage of this since this is only a single level and not a full campaign with persistent equipment. Instead, I placed specific items in specific locations that I consider to be the most useful for that area, an example being a crate of grenades found in the first room of the final combat encounter where there is a high density of enemies. I do think I ended up giving the player too much health throughout the level, but this is mitigated by Jeff's ability to one-shot the player. This small room is another case where I didn't want it to just be a button and a door. I included several interactables here to give the room a purpose and keep it from being just another hallway to the next part of the level. The player has to complete a hacking puzzle before gaining access to the toner puzzle. The toner puzzle itself is kind of backwards when compared to Valve's campaign, where most, if not all, toner puzzles require the player to turn the power on and/or redirect it somehow. In this case, I asked the player to turn the power off in order to disable the combine fence. There's another combine fence blocking the generator, and the player must disable that before gaining access to the solution. Pretty simple, but it is more interesting and enjoyable than simply opening a door. This puzzle serves to slow the pace and give the player a chance to relax. Once the toner puzzle is solved and the combine fence disabled, 3 zombies immediately smash through the walls and ambush the player from multiple sides, turning a would-be victory moment into a frantic fight for survival. The player still has their moment of triumph after dispatching the zombies, but they are reminded to keep their guard up. The player then heads up to the next floor. They are introduced to yet another combine fence blocking their path and several zombies lurking on the catwalks. These catwalks were meant to limit the player's movement, making the sequence more difficult and tense. Previously, I mentioned I placed some systems and mechanics in that level to provide opportunities for dynamic gameplay. This section is an example of how that didn't work out. There is another blind zombie near the console the player needs to access in order to shut off the fence. I wanted Jeff to actively hunt down the player similar to Mr. X in the Resident Evil games or the Ubermorph in Dead Space 2. The player would have no choice but to attack the zombies to get past them, which would attract Jeff's attention. Jeff tended to get stuck on these zombies, especially with the catwalks being narrow in the first place. I created an AI relationship with the zombies and Jeff so they would ignore each other and not get stuck. This helped a bit, but Jeff still wasn't as aggressive as I wanted him to be. Jeff can still chase the player, but it is easy to outrun him, and gunning down the zombies wasn't a problem even when Jeff made his way to the source of the commotion. Instead of placing Jeff in the level and letting his behavior dictate the encounter, I think a better solution would have been to place a persistent sound effect, waypoint, or something similar on the player themselves so that while the player is traversing the catwalks, Jeff is chasing them down without deviating from his target to slow down and investigate other sounds. The player then shuts off the combine fence and heads to the next floor. From here, the player can see where the level started on the bottom floor and also the catwalk encounter they just escaped from. I found it satisfying to keep much of the level progression visible to the player, and it made for a more coherent experience.